believe that human history is a straight line, that we began in caves and climbed step by patient step upward and onward until we reach the world we live in today, that progress is a ladder and we have been climbing it without interruption since the dawn of our kind. It is a comforting story. It is the story we are all taught, and it may be one of the greatest illusions our species has ever told itself, because hidden in the ice, buried in the myths of 100 cultures, written into the geology of our own planet, there is another story, a darker story, a story that suggests we are not the triumphant first, but merely the latest, that before us there may have been others who rose and built and reached toward the light and were then erased so completely that we have forgotten they ever existed. History, it seems, has a delete button, and the evidence is mounting that it has been pressed before, more than once. Every so often, on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded memory, something happens to this planet. The climate convulses, the skies burn or darken, the waters rise, the great beasts die in their millions, some of them so suddenly that they are frozen mid-meal, food still in their mouths. Entire worlds of living things are swept away in what may be, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. And when the dust settles and the survivors crawl out of the ruins, they remember almost nothing except a story of the time the world ended. The ancient Egyptians told a Greek philosopher that mankind had been destroyed many times and would be destroyed again. The sacred texts of India describe vast cycles of ages, each ending in catastrophe, each followed by a new beginning. And across the entire globe, from Mesopotamia to the Americas to the islands of the Pacific, we find the same haunting memory repeated again and again: fire from the sky, a long and terrible darkness, and a flood that drowned the world. What if all of these were not myths at all? What if they were memories, eyewitness accounts passed down across the generations of a real and recurring catastrophe that has struck our planet before and struck it hard enough to wipe the slate clean? And if it is a cycle, if the Great Reset is a rhythm rather than a random accident, then it raises a question that should chill you to the bone. When is it due again? And how would we, with all our technology and all our pride, actually fare when the clock runs out? You will see the evidence buried in the earth. You will hear the memories preserved in the world's oldest stories. And you will decide for yourself whether the earth has wiped civilization clean before, and whether it is preparing to do so again. This is the story of the Great Reset. Welcome. Let us begin with the story you already know, the official story, the one written in the textbooks and repeated so often that it has become the invisible background of how we understand ourselves. It goes like this. Human beings emerged long ago as primitive hunter-gatherers, scraping a living from a harsh world. For tens of thousands of years, nothing much changed. Then, around 10 to 12,000 years ago, something shifted. We invented agriculture. We settled down. We built villages, then towns, then cities. Writing appeared. Kingdoms rose. And from that foundation, humanity climbed steadily upward through the ancient empires, through the classical world, through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution, all the way to the global technological civilization we inhabit today. It is a story of progress, of accumulation, of one generation building upon the achievements of the last, in an unbroken chain reaching back to the very beginning. In this telling, we are the summit, the highest point humanity has ever reached. Everything before us was a step on the staircase that leads, inevitably, to us. And there is real truth in it. The broad outline is not wrong, but it contains a hidden and comforting assumption, one so deep that most of us never even notice it is there. The assumption is this, that the climb was smooth, that progress, once it began, was continuous, that nothing has ever come along on a global scale to knock humanity all the way back down the staircase and force us to start again from the bottom. That assumption may be false. And when you start to look closely at the geology, at the ancient stories, at the strange gaps and mysteries in our deep past, a very different pattern begins to emerge. A pattern the comfortable story of progress cannot explain. Consider what we actually find when we dig into the record of our planet. We find that the end of the last ice age was not a gentle, gradual warming, but a period of violent, whiplashing climate chaos, including one moment around 12,800 years ago, when the warming world suddenly slammed back into deep cold, almost overnight in geological terms. We find layers in the earth spread across continents containing exotic materials, platinum, nanodiamonds, melted glass, that some scientists argue are the signature of a cosmic catastrophe. We find the remains of great animals, mammoths and mastodons and giant bison, that died in enormous numbers at almost exactly that moment, some of them preserved so strangely that they seem to have been frozen where they stood. And then we find something even stranger. We find that human beings all over the world, in cultures that could not possibly have been in contact with one another, remember it, or remember something. They tell over and over the same basic story, that the sky once rained fire, that the world was plunged into darkness, that a great flood swept across the earth and destroyed almost everyone, and that the few who survived had to begin civilization all over again. Why would people separated by entire oceans, who never met, who spoke unrelated languages, independently invent the same catastrophe? Why do the sacred traditions of India speak of cycles of destruction and renewal stretching back across unimaginable spans of time? Why did the priests of ancient Egypt tell a visiting Greek philosopher, quite matter-of-factly, that mankind had already been destroyed many times over, and that the Greeks remembered only the most recent? Here is the possibility that this documentary will explore, that the comfortable story of unbroken progress is incomplete, that our history is not a single straight climb, but something more like a series of climbs, each one rising toward sophistication, each one cut short by a global catastrophe, each one followed by a long, dark age of forgetting, and then a new beginning that starts over almost from scratch. That we are not the first civilization to reach for the heights, only the first to have forgotten how many came before. This is not a fringe fantasy invented by dreamers. Elements of it are argued in serious scientific journals. The Younger Dryas event is real, and its violence is not in dispute. The strange layer in the earth is real, even if its cause is debated. The flood myths are real, and their global distribution is a genuine puzzle. What is contested, fiercely contested, is what it all means when you put it together. Is it a scattering of unrelated facts, or is it the fingerprint of something vast and recurring, a reset button that the earth or the cosmos has pressed before and may press again? Over the course of this journey, we are going to gather the evidence piece by piece. We will begin with the ancient traditions, the memory of many destructions preserved by Plato and the Egyptians, and the great cyclical cosmology of the Hindu Yugas, to see how deeply the idea of the reset is woven into human thought. Then we will turn to the hard science of the Younger Dryas, the sudden cold snap that ended the ice age in chaos, and to the controversial evidence of a cosmic impact, the comet, the platinum, the nanodiamonds, the frozen mammoths. We will confront the most extreme idea of all, the theory that the very crust of the Earth can shift, that the poles themselves can move, and the world can, in a sense, turn over. We will hear the global flood myths as possible eyewitness testimony. We will examine a reset we can actually document, the collapse of the Bronze Age, when a whole interconnected civilization fell apart in a matter of decades. And finally, we will ask the two questions that haunt this entire subject. Is there a cycle, a clock ticking beneath all of this? And if there is, are we right now overdue? Keep one thing in mind as we go. The people of every lost world believed, just as we do, that their civilization was permanent, that the sun would always rise on their cities, that tomorrow would look like today. They could not imagine their world ending. And then it did. Let us find out whether they have something to tell us. Around 2,400 years ago in the city of Athens, the philosopher Plato wrote down a story. It was, he claimed, a true account, handed down through his own family, of something that had happened long before, when one of the wisest men in the history of Greece traveled to Egypt and spoke with its priests. And what those priests told him has echoed down the centuries as one of the most provocative statements in all of ancient literature. The Greek was Solon, the famous lawgiver of Athens, a man revered for his wisdom. According to Plato, Solon journeyed to the ancient Egyptian city of Sais, and there he fell into conversation with the priests, who were the keepers of records stretching back further than any in Greece. Solon, proud of his own culture's antiquity, began to tell them the oldest stories the Greeks possessed, tales of the earliest ancestors, of the first men, of the beginning of things as the Greeks understood it. And the Egyptian priest, listening, was not impressed. Instead, according to Plato, he said something that must have stunned the proud Athenian. He told Solon, in effect, that the Greeks were children, that they knew nothing of the true depths of the past. And then he explained why. There have been, and there will be again, the priest said, many destructions of mankind. The world, he explained, is periodically devastated, sometimes by fire, sometimes by water, and in these catastrophes, the vast majority of humanity is wiped out. And here was the crucial point. It is not the sophisticated, literate, city-dwelling peoples who tend to survive. It is the simple ones. The herdsmen and the mountain folk, those without writing, without records, without the accumulated knowledge of a great civilization. The consequence, the priest explained, is devastating. Every time one of these catastrophes strikes, the peoples who possessed learning and history are destroyed, and only the illiterate survivors remain. And so, again and again, humanity is stripped of its memory. The survivors have to begin all over like children, knowing nothing of the great deeds and disasters that came before. Civilization is not one continuous story. It is a story that keeps being erased and restarted, its earlier chapters lost each time the world is scoured clean. You, the priest told Solon, remember only one flood, but there have been many before it. And because Greece is repeatedly stripped of its educated class, you retain no memory of the truly ancient world. Egypt, protected by the peculiar geography of the Nile, preserves a longer record and knows that mankind has risen and fallen many times. Now pause and consider how remarkable this is. Set aside for a moment the question of whether every detail is literally true. Simply consider the idea itself being articulated more than 2,000 years ago. This is not a vague myth of a single great flood. This is a fully formed theory of history as a cycle of catastrophe and amnesia. It describes in plain terms a world in which advanced cultures repeatedly arise, are destroyed by natural cataclysms, and are forgotten, so that each new civilization believes itself to be the first, when in truth it is merely the latest in a long series. That is precisely the pattern this entire documentary is exploring. And here it is, laid out with startling clarity, by an Egyptian priest speaking to a Greek statesman, recorded by the greatest philosopher of the ancient world. It is worth dwelling on the specific mechanism the priest describes because it is subtle and psychologically astute. He is not merely saying that disasters happen, he is explaining why we forget them. The knowledge of a civilization, its history, its science, its records, is carried by a relatively small, educated portion of the population, and it is concentrated in exactly the kinds of places, the cities, the low-lying centers, the coasts, that a great catastrophe destroys most thoroughly. The survivors are the scattered, the rural, the marginal. They keep their lives, but they do not keep the libraries. They carry forward the species, but not its memory. And so the deep past is repeatedly amputated from human awareness, leaving each new civilization to gaze back into a fog, seeing only a few thousand years, and assuming that beyond that fog there was nothing but savagery. This single idea, if it is true, would transform how we understand our own place in time. It would mean that the few thousand years of recorded history we possess are not the whole story of civilized humanity, but merely the most recent segment, the part that has happened since the last great forgetting. It would mean that the darkness before recorded history might not be empty at all, but full of risen and fallen worlds we simply cannot see. Of course, we must be careful. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian in the modern sense, and he used stories to make points. Some scholars argue that the tale of Solon and the Egyptian priests is a literary device, a way for Plato to frame his famous account of Atlantis, which appears in the very same dialogues. The story of many destructions is intimately bound up with the story of Atlantis, the great civilization that Plato says was swallowed by the sea in a single terrible day and night. And mainstream scholarship generally treats Atlantis as a fable, a moral allegory, rather than a real lost world. But even the skeptics must reckon with something. Whether or not Solon truly made his journey, whether or not the Egyptian priests said these exact words, the idea itself is there, articulated with sophistication more than 2 millennia ago. Someone, at some point, conceived of human history as a cycle of catastrophe and renewal. Someone understood that a global disaster would preferentially destroy the learned and spare the simple. Someone grasped that this would erase memory and reset the human story again and again. Where did such an idea come from? Was it pure philosophical speculation? Or was it, as the priest insisted, based on records, on genuine ancient memory of real events? And here is what makes it so difficult to dismiss entirely. Plato and the Egyptians were not alone. This was not some isolated Greek fancy. On the other side of the world, in a completely different civilization, with no contact whatsoever with the Mediterranean, another culture had developed an even grander, even more elaborate vision of exactly the same idea. A vision of time itself as an endless wheel of ages, each rising into golden light and each collapsing into darkness and destruction, turning over and over across spans of time so vast they make the entire recorded history of the West look like a single afternoon. The priests of Egypt told Solon of many destructions. But it was in the sacred traditions of ancient India that the cycle of catastrophe was mapped out in its most complete and staggering form. To understand just how deeply the idea of the Great Reset is woven into the human mind, we must travel east to the doctrine of the Yugas. Travel now to the Indian subcontinent, to one of the oldest continuous religious and philosophical traditions on earth. Here, in the sacred texts of Hinduism, texts whose roots reach back thousands of years, we find a vision of time so vast, so intricate, and so alien to the modern Western mind that it can be genuinely difficult to absorb. It is a vision in which the idea of the Great Reset is not a footnote, not a half-remembered myth, but the very architecture of reality itself. In the Western tradition, time is usually imagined as a line. It has a beginning, it moves forward, and it heads toward an end. History goes somewhere. But in the Hindu conception, time is not a line at all. It is a wheel. It turns and turns and turns endlessly through vast cycles of creation, decline, destruction, and renewal. And within this turning wheel lies a detailed map of the rise and fall of ages, a map that describes again and again the same fundamental pattern: worlds that flourish, worlds that decay, and worlds that are destroyed only for the cycle to begin once more. At the heart of this system is the concept of the Yuga. A Yuga is an age, an epoch, a great span of time, and according to the tradition, the world passes through a repeating sequence of 4 of them, over and over in an unending cycle. The first is the Satya Yuga, sometimes called the Krita Yuga, the age of truth and purity. This is the golden age, the highest and best of the 4. In this era, humanity is said to be virtuous, wise, long-lived, and spiritually elevated. The world is close to perfect. People live in harmony with the cosmic order, and knowledge and righteousness are at their peak. It is a paradise age, a time of light. But perfection does not last. The wheel turns, and the world enters the second age, the Treta Yuga. Here, something has begun to decline. Virtue diminishes. The purity of the golden age fades, just slightly at first. Humanity is still noble, still capable of great things, but the perfection has cracked. A measure of imperfection, of conflict, of spiritual distance has entered the world. The wheel turns again into the third age, the Dvapara Yuga. Now the decline has deepened. Virtue has fallen further. Disease, discord, and suffering grow more common. Human lifespans shorten. The connection to the sacred order weakens. The world is now half fallen, poised between the light of the earlier ages and the darkness to come. And then comes the fourth and final age, the Kali Yuga, the dark age, the age of strife, discord, and decline. According to the tradition, this is the worst of the 4 ages, a time when virtue reaches its lowest ebb, when corruption and conflict and spiritual blindness dominate the world, when human beings are at their most short-lived and their most disconnected from truth. And crucially, according to the tradition, the Kali Yuga is the age in which we are said to be living now. At the end of the Kali Yuga, the cycle reaches its conclusion. The world, having fallen as far as it can fall, is brought to an end, dissolved, destroyed, cleansed. And then, out of that ending, the wheel turns once more, and a new Satya Yuga, a new golden age, dawns. The whole magnificent sequence begins again, from purity to decline, to darkness, to destruction, to renewal, forever. This 4-age cycle, this progression from golden age to dark age and back again, is the beating heart of the Hindu vision of time. But what truly staggers the modern mind is the scale on which it is said to operate. The numbers involved are almost incomprehensibly vast. According to traditional reckonings, a single complete cycle of the four yugas spans not centuries, not millennia, but a period conventionally counted in the millions of years. And even that is only the beginning. These four-age cycles themselves repeat over and over, 1,000 of them making up a still greater unit of cosmic time, a single day in the life of the creator god Brahma, a span of billions of years. And beyond even that lie greater cycles still, nested within one another like wheels within wheels within wheels, stretching across durations so immense that the entire span of recorded human history, the whole of it, from the first cities to this very moment, would not even register as a flicker. Try to sit with that for a moment. Here is a civilization, thousands of years ago, that had conceived of time not in the small human terms of a few generations, but in spans of millions and billions of years. A civilization that imagined the universe rising and falling through cosmic ages of almost unthinkable length. It is a vision of time closer in its sheer scale to modern cosmology and geology than to anything else in the ancient world. And whatever one makes of its literal truth, its grandeur is undeniable. But for our purposes, in this investigation of the Great Reset, the scale is not even the most important part. The most important part is the shape, because the Yuga doctrine is, at its core, a doctrine of the reset. It describes a world that does not progress endlessly upward, but rises and falls in an eternal rhythm. It describes ages of light that decay into ages of darkness. It describes at the end of each great cycle a destruction, followed by a renewal, a wiping clean of the world, followed by a fresh beginning. And notice too the direction of the story it tells. This is not a tale of progress, of humanity climbing ever upward from primitive beginnings toward a glorious future. It is, if anything, the reverse. It describes a fall. It places the golden age, the age of the greatest wisdom and virtue and knowledge, not in the future, but in the deep past. In this vision, the ancients were not our crude, ignorant ancestors. They were our superiors, closer to the source, wiser and purer than we are. And we, in the dark Kali Yuga, are the diminished, fallen descendants of a greater age that has been lost. This is a profound inversion of the modern story of progress, and it echoes in its own way something we saw in the previous part, the Egyptian priest telling Solon that there were greater and more ancient civilizations that had been destroyed and forgotten. Here, too, in India, is the idea that the deepest past held something higher than the present, and that it was lost in the turning of the great cycle. Now we must approach this carefully and honestly. The Yuga cosmology is a religious and philosophical vision, not a scientific record, and it should not be mistaken for a literal chronicle of datable events. The immense timescales do not correspond to the archaeological record of human civilization as we understand it, and mainstream scholarship does not treat the Yugas as a historical account of real, successive, global catastrophes. To read the Yugas as a straightforward log of past resets would be to misunderstand what kind of text they are. And yet, step back and consider the sheer fact of it. Here is another ancient culture, entirely separate from the Egyptians and the Greeks, on the far side of the ancient world, that independently arrived at the same essential intuition, that time is cyclical, that ages rise and fall, that worlds are destroyed and renewed, that catastrophe and forgetting are woven into the very fabric of existence. Two great civilizations with no shared source, both convinced that the human story is not a single climb, but a wheel of destruction and rebirth. Why? Why does this idea keep appearing? Is it simply that human beings, observing the cycles of nature, the day and night, the seasons, the birth and death of all living things, naturally project cycles onto history as well? That is certainly possible, and we should not dismiss it. The cyclical view of time may be a natural product of the human mind, observing a cyclical world. But there is another possibility, the one that haunts this entire subject. What if these traditions, the Egyptian memory of many destructions, the Hindu wheel of ages, are not pure philosophy at all? What if, buried within them, distorted and mythologized and stretched across impossible timescales, there lies a kernel of genuine memory, a memory of real catastrophes, real destructions, real resets that struck humanity in the deep past and were preserved, however imperfectly, in the sacred stories of those who survived? To test that possibility, we have to leave the world of myth and philosophy behind and turn to the hard evidence written in the earth itself. Because there is one moment in the relatively recent past of our planet, a specific window of time around 12,800 years ago, when something happened that was violent enough, sudden enough, and global enough to have been exactly the kind of catastrophe these ancient traditions seem to remember. Scientists have a name for it. They call it the Younger Dryas. We now leave behind the world of ancient philosophy and sacred cosmology and step onto the firmer ground of physical science. Because there is a moment in the recent history of our planet that is not a matter of myth or speculation, a moment whose reality is accepted by essentially every scientist who studies the deep past. It is a moment of genuine documented global catastrophe, and it sits like a dark star at the very center of the mystery of the Great Reset. It is called the Younger Dryas. To understand what the Younger Dryas was, we first have to understand what was happening to the world just before it. Picture the planet around 15,000 years ago. For tens of thousands of years, the Earth had been locked in the grip of the last ice age. Vast sheets of ice, kilometers thick, had covered much of the northern hemisphere. But now, at last, the great cold was ending. The world was warming. The ice sheets were beginning to melt and retreat. Temperatures were climbing. Life was expanding into newly freed lands. After an age of ice, the world was thawing into warmth, and everything, everywhere, was beginning to change. This was the dawn of a new era. Plants recolonized the warming ground. Animals spread into new territories. And human beings, the hunter-gatherers of the late Ice Age, followed the retreating ice and the spreading abundance, moving into landscapes that had been frozen wastelands for millennia. The world was becoming, slowly, the world we would recognize. The long winter of the Ice Age was ending, and a warmer, gentler age seemed to be arriving. And then, with breathtaking suddenness, it all reversed. Around 12,800 years ago, the warming stopped. Not gradually, not gently. It stopped, and it violently reversed. In a span of time that, by the standards of climate, is almost incomprehensibly short, perhaps just decades, perhaps even less, the Earth plunged back into brutal, glacial cold. The warmth that had been returning to the world was snuffed out. The ice, which had been retreating, surged back. Temperatures in some regions dropped by staggering amounts, plummeting back toward Ice Age conditions almost overnight in geological terms. The world that had been climbing out of the deep freeze was hurled straight back into it. This is the Younger Dryas, a sudden, severe, and sustained return to near glacial conditions, striking a world that had been in the middle of warming up. It lasted, this cold snap, for something on the order of 1,000 years or more. And then, at its end, the climate flipped back again, just as abruptly, plunging into rapid warming that finally brought the Ice Age to a close for good. The name itself comes from a small Arctic flower, the Dryas, whose pollen turns up in the geological layers of this period across parts of Europe, a marker of the cold tundra conditions that swept back over lands that had been warming. It is a modest name for a colossal event. Because make no mistake, the Younger Dryas was one of the most dramatic and rapid climate shifts in the entire recent history of our planet. Now, let us try to grasp what this would have meant, not as an abstraction on a graph, but as a lived reality for the plants, the animals, and the people caught in it. Imagine a world that has been warming for centuries. Imagine the great herds of Ice Age animals, the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant bison, the horses and camels and ground sloths that roam the northern continents, adapting to a landscape that is becoming greener and more abundant. Imagine the human hunter-gatherers who followed those herds, spreading into newly habitable lands, their populations growing, their world expanding. For generations, the trend has been toward warmth, toward abundance, toward life, and then the sky turns against them. Within a span of time short enough that individual people would have witnessed it, the temperature crashes, the warmth vanishes, the cold comes roaring back, and with it, drought and ecological chaos in many regions. The vegetation that animals depended on withers or shifts. The delicate balance of the warming world is shattered. Ecosystems that had been expanding suddenly collapse, and the great animals and the people who depended on them are thrown into crisis. This is not a gentle climatic adjustment. This is a catastrophe unfolding within living memory. A world turned upside down in the span of a lifetime or two. The generation that was born into a warming, hopeful world would have grown old in a world of returning ice and dying abundance. To them, it might well have seemed that the world itself was ending, that some terrible force had reached down and struck the warmth from the sky. And here is what makes the timing of the Younger Dryas so electric, so central to our entire investigation. Look at when it happens, around 12,800 years ago. This is precisely the window, at the end of the Ice Age, when human beings across the world were poised at a great threshold. It is close to the time when, in the conventional story, humanity was on the verge of the agricultural revolution, on the cusp of settling down and building the first civilizations. It is the hinge point of the human story, the transition from the old world of the Ice Age to the new world that would give rise to everything we call civilization. And right there, at that exact hinge, the world convulses. A sudden, violent global catastrophe strikes, plunging the warming planet back into cold, devastating ecosystems, and coinciding with a great die-off of the large animals of the Ice Age. Whatever human cultures existed in that moment, whatever they were building or becoming, would have been hit by one of the most severe environmental shocks in the entire span of human existence. Is it any wonder, then, that this event sits at the heart of the Great Reset hypothesis? Here is a real, scientifically established global catastrophe striking at the precise moment when humanity was crossing the threshold toward civilization. If ever there was a candidate for a real event behind the ancient memories of destruction, behind the Egyptian priests' many destructions of mankind, behind the flood myths of 100 cultures, the Younger Dryas is it. It is the right kind of event of the right magnitude at the right time. But this raises the enormous question that has divided scientists for years. and that we must now confront directly. We know that the Younger Dryas happened. That is not in dispute. The rocks and the ice cores record it plainly. What is fiercely disputed is why it happened. What could possibly cause the entire warming climate of a planet to reverse itself so suddenly and so violently and plunge back into the cold? For a long time, the leading explanation was a purely terrestrial one, having to do with the melting ice sheets themselves. As the great glaciers melted, they released enormous volumes of cold, fresh water into the oceans, and some scientists proposed that a truly massive pulse of this meltwater, perhaps from the catastrophic draining of an enormous glacial lake, flooded into the North Atlantic and disrupted the great ocean currents that carry warmth around the globe. Shut down that oceanic conveyor belt, the theory goes, and the northern hemisphere plunges into cold. It is a compelling idea, and many scientists consider some version of it the most likely explanation. But there is another hypothesis, a far more dramatic one. A hypothesis that proposes the trigger for the Younger Dryas was not something that welled up from the Earth's own melting ice, but something that came from the sky. Something that struck our planet a cosmic blow, powerful enough to set the world on fire and hurl the climate into chaos. According to this idea, the great catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age was caused by the impact of a comet. And it is to that explosive and controversial idea, and to the strange physical evidence that may support it, that we turn next. What if the great cold that ended the Ice Age was not born of melting glaciers and shifting ocean currents, but was inflicted upon our planet from above? What if, at that fateful moment, around 12,800 years ago, the Earth was struck by a visitor from the depths of space, a blow so violent that it set the northern hemisphere ablaze, darkened the skies, and knocked the entire climate of the planet off its course? This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it is one of the most fiercely debated ideas in all of Earth science. To its supporters, it is the missing piece that explains the sudden catastrophe, the great die-off, and perhaps even the ancient memories of fire from the sky. To its critics, it is an extraordinary claim that the evidence does not support. We are going to lay out the case as its proponents make it, and then we will hear the objections. But first, let us understand what exactly this hypothesis proposes. The idea, in its essence, is this. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth encountered a comet, but not perhaps a single solid mountain-sized object striking the ground in one titanic crater. Instead, the hypothesis proposes something in some ways more insidious and more widespread, a fragmented comet, a great cometary body that had broken apart in space into a swarm of pieces, a cluster of fragments large and small, which the Earth then ran into. Rather than one colossal impact, the planet may have been subjected to multiple strikes and, crucially, multiple airbursts, explosions in the atmosphere as these fragments arrived. To understand why airbursts matter, consider what happens when a large object from space enters the atmosphere at tremendous speed. It does not always reach the ground intact. Very often, the immense stresses and heat cause it to detonate in the air, releasing its colossal energy in a violent explosion above the surface. We have seen small examples of this in modern times, atmospheric explosions of incoming space rocks that flattened forests or shattered windows across whole cities. Now scale that up dramatically, and imagine not one such airburst, but many occurring across a wide swath of the planet as the Earth passed through a stream of cometary debris. The result would be a series of devastating explosions in the skies, raining energy and fire down upon the land below. And now consider where, according to the hypothesis, some of these blows may have landed. At that moment in history, remember, the great Ice Age glaciers still lay across much of the northern hemisphere. An enormous ice sheet blanketed North America. And it is precisely this ice sheet, according to many versions of the hypothesis, that took the brunt of the cosmic assault. Imagine a barrage of cometary fragments and airbursts striking or detonating above, a continent-sized expanse of ice kilometers thick. The consequences of such an event would have been apocalyptic. The impacts and airbursts would have unleashed staggering amounts of energy. They could have triggered vast wildfires, firestorms sweeping across the landscapes of the northern hemisphere, consuming forests and grasslands on a continental scale. The proponents of the hypothesis point to evidence they interpret as signs of exactly such continent-wide burning at this moment in time. A horizon of soot and charcoal, the fingerprint, they argue, of a world briefly set aflame, and then, after the fire, the darkness. The smoke from continent-scale wildfires combined with the dust and debris hurled into the atmosphere by the impacts, and vast quantities of water vapor and pulverized ice blasted skyward from the shattered glaciers would have filled the upper atmosphere with a pall of particles. This shroud would have dimmed the sun, blocking its light and warmth, plunging the world into a period of cold and darkness. Here, potentially, is a mechanism for the sudden onset of the Younger Dryas cold, not a slow oceanic process, but a rapid, catastrophic darkening of the skies in the aftermath of a cosmic impact. There is more. A barrage of impacts and airbursts striking the North American ice sheet would have caused catastrophic, near instantaneous melting of colossal volumes of ice. This sudden flood of meltwater surging into the oceans could then have disrupted the ocean currents in exactly the way the more conventional theory describes, providing a bridge between the two explanations. In this view, the comet is the trigger, and the meltwater and ocean disruption are the mechanism that locks the cold in place for 1,000 years. The two ideas need not be entirely at odds. The impact could be the match that lights the fire. And consider what all of this would have meant for the living world. The firestorms would have consumed habitats and killed animals directly across vast regions. The ensuing darkness and cold would have devastated the vegetation that survived, collapsing the food chains that the great herds depended upon. This, the proponents argue, could help explain one of the enduring mysteries of this period: the sudden disappearance across the northern hemisphere of so many of the great Ice Age animals, the mammoths, the mastodons, and their kin, in what was one of the most significant mass extinctions of large animals in recent geological history. And it could help explain the disruption to human populations at the same moment, the archaeological signs that certain early cultures were thrown into crisis or vanished around this very time. Step back and look at the picture the hypothesis paints: a fragmenting comet, a rain of fire from the sky, continent-wide firestorms, a world plunged into darkness and cold, the great beasts dying in their multitudes, human culture shattered. It is quite literally an apocalypse, and it is proposed not by myth makers but by scientists, published in scientific journals, argued with data. If it is true, it would mean that the ancient memories, the fire from heaven, the long darkness, the destruction of the world, are not fantasies at all. They are history. But, and this is essential, we must now turn to the other side. Because the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is not accepted by the mainstream of science, it is a minority position. and it has met with sustained, serious, and substantial criticism. Honesty demands that we give that criticism its full weight. Many scientists remain unconvinced that any cosmic impact occurred at all. They point out that no definitive, universally accepted impact crater from this event has been identified, though proponents respond that airbursts and strikes onto ice sheets would leave little in the way of conventional craters. Critics argue that the evidence offered for the impact, the exotic materials in the sediment layer, which we will examine closely in the next part, can in some cases be explained by ordinary earthly processes, or that the findings have been difficult for independent researchers to reliably reproduce. They question whether the continent-wide fires really occurred as described, or whether the charcoal and soot evidence has been misinterpreted. And they note reasonably that a well-established alternative explanation for the Younger Dryas, the meltwater and ocean current disruption, already exists and does not require invoking a cosmic catastrophe at all. In short, the mainstream view remains that the Younger Dryas was most likely caused by terrestrial climate mechanisms, and that the case for a cometary impact, while intriguing, has not been proven to the satisfaction of most experts. The debate continues, sometimes heatedly, in the scientific literature, with new studies periodically claiming to support one side or the other. So where does that leave us? With a genuine and unresolved scientific controversy. On one side, a bold hypothesis that a cosmic impact triggered the great catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age, a hypothesis that, if true, would resonate powerfully with the ancient memories of fire and destruction. On the other side, a cautious mainstream that sees the sudden cold as the product of the Earth's own turbulent climate system and finds the impact evidence unconvincing. The heart of this dispute, the evidence over which the two camps wage their fiercest battles, lies in a thin, dark layer of sediment found at sites scattered across the world. A layer that some scientists say contains the unmistakable chemical and physical signature of a cosmic catastrophe. Tiny diamonds, droplets of once molten rock, and a spike of a rare and telling metal. To understand whether the comet was real, we have to dig into that layer and examine the strange materials buried within it. Buried in the ground at sites scattered across North America, across parts of Europe, across the Middle East, and beyond, there is a layer. It is thin, often just a few centimeters thick, a dark band in the sediment that to the untrained eye would look like nothing at all. But to the scientists who champion the Younger Dryas impact, this layer is a scene of a crime. It is, they argue, the physical fingerprint of the cosmic catastrophe, a horizon of ruin laid down at the very moment the world convulsed 12,800 years ago. And embedded within it are materials that they say should not be there unless something extraordinary and violent occurred. This layer has come to be known in some places as the black mat. It is a dark, organic, rich stratum found at numerous sites, and it sits at a telling position. Below it, in the older sediments, you find the bones of the great Ice Age animals, the mammoths and mastodons, and the tools of certain early human cultures. And above it, in the younger sediments, those animals and, in places, those cultures are gone. The black mat lies directly at the boundary. It is, quite literally, a line in the earth with a teeming world of Ice Age life on one side and a diminished, emptied world on the other. Whatever is recorded in that layer is recorded at the precise instant of the great die-off. And when scientists examined the material at this boundary closely, They reported finding a suite of strange and exotic substances. Substances that, taken together, the proponents argue, point unmistakably to a cosmic impact. Let us go through them one by one, because this is the physical heart of the entire case. The first is nanodiamonds. These are diamonds, but almost unimaginably tiny microscopic specks of diamond far too small to see. And they matter enormously because of how diamonds like these are thought to form. The formation of such nanodiamonds is associated with conditions of extreme temperature and pressure, precisely the kind of conditions produced by a cosmic impact or a powerful airburst. When something strikes the Earth or explodes violently in the atmosphere, the shock and heat can, under the right circumstances, forge these minuscule diamonds. So when researchers reported finding elevated concentrations of nanodiamonds in the Younger Dryas boundary layer across widely separated sites, they interpreted it as a powerful clue. Here, they argued, was material that testified to a moment of extraordinary violence, exactly what a cometary impact would produce. The second exotic material is melt glass and tiny spherules. When an impact or a high-energy airburst occurs, the intense heat can melt rock and soil, flash-melting earthly materials to extreme temperatures. As this molten material is thrown into the air and cools, it can form small, glassy droplets and beads, spherules, and glassy fragments that bear the signature of having been heated far beyond what any ordinary fire could achieve. The proponents of the hypothesis report finding exactly these kinds of high-temperature melt products in the boundary layer, materials that, they argue, required temperatures so extreme that they could not have been produced by wildfires or volcanic activity or any mundane process, but only by the ferocious energy of a cosmic impact event. And the third piece of evidence, perhaps the most striking of all, is a spike of platinum. Platinum is a rare metal in the Earth's crust. It is not something you find in abundance in ordinary surface sediments, but it is more common in certain kinds of extraterrestrial material, in comets and asteroids. And so a sudden, sharp spike in the concentration of platinum appearing precisely at a particular layer in the ground is the kind of thing that can signal the arrival of material from space. It is a similar logic to the famous evidence for the impact that helped end the age of the dinosaurs, where a spike in another rare element, iridium, found in a layer around the globe, provided key evidence for that ancient catastrophe. And this is what researchers reported finding at the Younger Dryas boundary, a distinct platinum spike. It has been detected at numerous sites, and notably, a pronounced platinum anomaly at the right point in time has also been identified in the ice of Greenland, locked into the frozen record of the atmosphere. To the proponents of the impact hypothesis, this platinum spike is a smoking gun. Here is a rare, telling metal associated with extraterrestrial material, spiking sharply at the exact moment of the Younger Dryas onset, recorded both in sediments across continents and in the Greenland ice. What could deposit such a signature across such a wide area at such a precise moment, if not the arrival of cometary debris? Put it all together, and the proponents present a formidable sounding case, a distinct layer in the Earth sitting exactly at the boundary of the great die-off. Within it, nanodiamonds forged by extreme pressure and heat, melt glass and spherules formed at temperatures beyond ordinary fire, and a spike of platinum, a metal linked to material from space. 4 lines of physical evidence, they argue, all pointing to the same conclusion, that a cosmic impact struck the Earth 12,800 years ago, laid down this layer of ruin, and triggered the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas. It is, on its face, a compelling story. But here, once again, we must apply the discipline of honesty, because this evidence is precisely where the scientific battle has been most intense. Critics have challenged nearly every element of the case. Some researchers have reported difficulty reproducing certain of the findings, an essential test in science, arguing that when they examined boundary layer samples, they did not consistently find the claimed markers or found them at levels that did not match the original claims. Others have argued that some of the materials can be explained by ordinary non-catastrophic processes, that certain spherules might form through mundane means, that some carbon-based materials interpreted as nanodiamonds might be something else, that platinum can, under some circumstances, be concentrated by earthly processes rather than delivered from space. There have been disputes over the dating, over whether all these markers truly appear at exactly the same moment across all these sites, or whether the picture is messier than the clean story suggests. And skeptics point again to the absence of a definitive impact crater as a persistent problem for the whole hypothesis. The proponents, in turn, have vigorously defended their evidence, published further studies, reported new sites and new markers, and argued that the criticisms have been answered. And so the battle has swung back and forth, study after study, year after year, one of the most contentious running disputes in the earth sciences. What are we then to make of it? We must resist the temptation to declare the matter settled in either direction, because it is not. What we can say is this: there is genuinely a boundary layer marking the onset of the Younger Dryas. There is genuinely a great die-off of large animals associated with this period. And there are genuinely reports of exotic materials, platinum, nanodiamonds, melt glass at this boundary, reported by serious scientists at multiple sites, even as other serious scientists dispute their interpretation. The evidence is real in the sense that it has been reported and published. Its meaning is what remains in fierce contention. But whatever the final verdict on the comet, there remains one category of evidence from this period that is so vivid, so visceral, and so deeply strange that it has haunted the imagination of everyone who has encountered it. It does not involve microscopic diamonds or trace metals. It involves the bodies of the great beasts themselves, the mammoths, found in conditions that seem, to many who behold them, almost impossible to explain by any ordinary death. Frozen, sometimes remarkably preserved, and, in the most famous and disturbing accounts, with the food still in their mouths. Of all the mysteries surrounding the end of the Ice Age, none has gripped the human imagination quite like the frozen mammoths. There's something about them, something visceral and haunting, that lodges in the mind and will not leave. The image is unforgettable: a great beast, an animal the size of an elephant, entombed in the frozen ground of the far north, its flesh preserved across thousands of years, and, in the most startling accounts, food still present in its mouth or stomach, as though death came so suddenly that it caught the animal in the very act of eating. What could kill a creature so instantly and freeze it so quickly that its last meal never even had time to digest? For many who encounter this mystery, the answer seems to demand something extraordinary: a sudden, violent, catastrophic event. Exactly the kind of event that the Great Reset hypothesis proposes. Let us look closely at what has actually been found and at what it may and may not mean. It is a genuine fact that the frozen ground of Siberia and Alaska has yielded remarkably preserved remains of Ice Age animals, above all the woolly mammoth. In the permafrost, the permanently frozen soil of these northern regions, the bodies of mammoths have been discovered in states of preservation that can be astonishing. Not merely bones, but flesh, skin, hair, and internal organs, preserved across many thousands of years by the deep cold. In some famous cases, the remains have been so well preserved that the animals look at first glance as though they died recently rather than in the depths of prehistory. There are accounts of preserved stomach contents and vegetation associated with the mouths of some specimens, undigested plant material that speaks of a final meal interrupted. This is real. These discoveries are documented, and they are genuinely remarkable. The permafrost of the North is one of the great natural preservers on our planet, a deep freeze that has kept the bodies of long-dead animals intact across a span of time that beggars belief. And to stand before such a creature, to see the hair still on its hide, and to know that it walked the earth when the ice age was ending, is to feel the deep past reach out and touch you. Now, to the proponents of a great catastrophe, these frozen giants are powerful witnesses. The reasoning goes like this. For an animal to be preserved with food undigested in its mouth or stomach, it must have died very suddenly and been frozen very quickly. A slow death, or a body left to lie in a merely cold environment, would decay. Scavengers would tear it apart. The soft tissues would rot away long before any freezing could preserve them. But here are animals seemingly caught mid-meal, their flesh preserved intact. Does this not suggest a sudden catastrophic freezing? Some have painted a dramatic picture, a world convulsed by cataclysm, temperatures crashing with impossible speed, great beasts struck down and flash-frozen where they stood, entombed in an instant by a catastrophe that overtook them faster than they could even swallow. And there is more to fuel the imagination. In parts of Siberia and Alaska, there exist vast deposits of frozen sediment, sometimes called muck, that contain a jumbled, chaotic mixture of animal bones, whole and partial carcasses, splintered trees and debris, all tangled together and frozen. To some observers, these chaotic deposits look like the aftermath of an immense violence, as though enormous forces had swept across the land, ripping up forests, killing animals en masse, and burying them together in a churned and frozen grave. Here, they argue, is the signature of catastrophe written large across the northern landscapes, not the gentle one-at-a-time death of animals in a stable world, but mass death, sudden and violent, on a scale that demands a cataclysmic explanation. Taken at face value, it is a chilling and dramatic picture. Great herds of mammoths and other beasts living in the warming world at the end of the Ice Age, suddenly annihilated by a catastrophe, flash-frozen mid-meal, and swept into chaotic mass graves. If true, it would be vivid, physical bodily evidence of exactly the kind of sudden global cataclysm at the heart of the reset hypothesis. It would be the great die-off made flesh. But here, as with every part of this investigation, we owe it to the truth to slow down and examine the sober counterarguments, because mainstream science interprets these frozen remains very differently, and its explanations deserve a full and fair hearing. First, the matter of the mass extinction itself. It is beyond dispute that the mammoths and many other large Ice Age animals did die out across the northern hemisphere around the end of the Ice Age. But mainstream science generally does not attribute this to a single instantaneous catastrophe. Instead, it points to a combination of factors unfolding over a period of time. The dramatic climate and environmental upheaval of the end of the Ice Age, including the Younger Dryas cold snap, which transformed and destroyed the habitats these animals depended on, and significantly the pressure of human hunting as expanding populations of skilled hunters preyed upon these great beasts. In this view, the extinction was real and significant, but it was a process driven by changing environments and human predation, not a single moment of flash-frozen annihilation. Second, the dramatic image of instantaneous flash freezing is one that many scientists regard with considerable caution. The preservation of animals in permafrost, they argue, does not actually require a magical world-freezing catastrophe. An animal that died and was quickly buried by falling into a bog or a river, by being trapped in mud, by being covered in a mudslide or collapsing sediment could then be incorporated into the permafrost and preserved over time by the ordinary deep cold of these already frigid regions. The key is rapid burial, protecting the body from scavengers and decay, rather than an impossibly sudden drop in temperature across the whole world. Undigested stomach contents, in this view, indicate that an individual animal died relatively quickly from drowning, from becoming mired, from a fall, not that the entire planet froze in an instant. Third, the chaotic muck deposits. Mainstream geology tends to explain these not as the debris of a single global cataclysm, but as the accumulated result of ordinary but powerful natural processes operating over long periods, the action of rivers, the seasonal freezing and thawing of the ground, slope collapses, and the general churning of sediment in these dynamic northern landscapes. Bones and debris accumulating and mixing over thousands of years in an environment of shifting frozen ground can produce jumbled deposits without requiring a single apocalyptic event. So we are left once again with two competing visions of the same haunting evidence. On one side, the dramatic interpretation, frozen giants struck down mid-meal by a sudden cataclysm, physical witnesses to the Great Reset. On the other, the sober mainstream view, real and remarkable preservation, and a real and significant extinction explained by the powerful but not instantaneous forces of climate upheaval, human hunting, rapid local burial, and the ordinary deep cold of the north. Which is right? As so often in this story, certainty eludes us. The frozen mammoths are real. Their preservation is real. The extinction is real. What remains contested is the cause and the speed. Whether we are looking at the aftermath of a single world-shattering event or at the accumulated evidence of a turbulent age of change. The mammoths, magnificent and mysterious, keep their final secret locked in the ice. And yet, when we set these frozen giants beside everything else we have seen, the sudden violence of the Younger Dryas, the disputed evidence of a cosmic impact, the strange layer in the earth, we can understand why so many have felt that something extraordinary happened at the end of the Ice Age. Something that killed the great beasts, reshaped the world, and may have struck at humanity itself. And there are those who believe that the cause was more extraordinary still, that the catastrophe involved not just fire from the sky, but a violent movement of the earth itself, a shifting of the very crust of the planet. A day when, in a sense, the earth turned over. We come now to the most extreme, the most dramatic, and the most controversial idea in this entire investigation. An idea so vast in its implications that, if it were true, it would dwarf even a cometary impact. It is the idea that the catastrophe at the heart of the Great Reset was not merely something that fell from the sky, but something that happened to the body of the Earth itself, that the very crust of our planet can shift dramatically and catastrophically so that the poles move, the continents are flung into new positions relative to the axis of spin, and the entire face of the world is remade in a spasm of geological violence. It is the idea, as it is sometimes dramatically put, of the day the earth turned over. To understand this idea, we first need to distinguish it from something more mundane. Scientists have long known that the Earth's magnetic field can reverse, that magnetic north and magnetic south can swap places over geological time. That is an established fact, and it is not what we are talking about here. We are also not talking about the slow, gentle wobble of the Earth's axis over tens of thousands of years, which is well understood and gradual. No. The idea we are examining is far more radical and far more sudden. It is the idea that the solid, rocky crust of the earth, the outer shell on which we live, can slip as a whole over the more fluid interior beneath it, that the entire skin of the planet can rotate, shifting the position of the surface relative to the poles, so that lands which were once temperate are dragged toward the frozen poles, and lands which were once polar are carried toward the warmth, all in a geologically brief and catastrophic episode. This is the concept of crustal displacement, sometimes called crustal slippage, or in its various forms, catastrophic pole shift. And the man whose name is most associated with bringing it to public attention was not a fringe crank, but a respectable American academic named Charles Hapgood. Hapgood, writing in the mid-20th century, developed and popularized the theory that the Earth's crust could undergo such displacements. His idea, in essence, was that the crust of the Earth is not locked immovably to the interior, but can, under certain conditions, shift over it. He proposed various mechanisms by which this might happen, including the idea that the uneven accumulation of ice at the poles could, over time, create an imbalance, a destabilizing force that might eventually cause the whole crust to slip, seeking a new equilibrium. When it slipped, the surface features of the Earth, the continents, the oceans, would be carried to new latitudes. A shift like this, Hapgood suggested, could move entire land masses into or out of the polar zones, radically and rapidly changing their climates. Hapgood's ideas attracted a remarkable degree of attention, and it is often noted that no less a figure than Albert Einstein found the concept interesting enough to engage with, writing a foreword to one of Hapgood's books and expressing that the idea was worthy of serious consideration, even while the full mechanism remained unproven. This lent the theory a certain prestige, and the idea has since been taken up, developed, and dramatized by numerous later writers and researchers, becoming a cornerstone of many alternative theories about lost civilizations and ancient catastrophes. Now, let us allow ourselves to imagine for a moment what such an event would actually be like, because if the crust of the Earth were to shift suddenly, the consequences would be almost beyond comprehension. Picture it. The solid ground beneath your feet, the very continent you stand upon, begins to move, not in the localized shaking of an earthquake, but as part of a vast, planet-wide displacement of the entire crust. Lands are dragged across latitudes. Regions that were warm are hauled toward the poles, plunging in a geological instant into killing cold. The very kind of sudden freezing that some have invoked to explain the frozen mammoths. Other regions, once icy, are carried toward the equator, their glaciers beginning to melt. The oceans, which do not move with the crust in the same way, would not stay obediently in their basins. As the crust shifted beneath them, the waters would surge and slosh across the changing surface, unleashing colossal floods, immense waves scouring across the land, drowning coastlines and low-lying regions on a global scale. Here, some proponents argue, is a mechanism for the great flood of universal memory, not merely rising seas, but a planet-wide sloshing of the oceans as the crust lurched into a new position. The strain on the Earth's interior would trigger cataclysmic earthquakes and volcanic eruptions across the globe. The atmosphere would be thrown into chaos, unleashing storms and darkness. It would be, in every sense, the end of a world. A single terrible episode in which fire, flood, freezing, and earthquake all struck at once, remaking the map of the planet and annihilating whatever civilizations lay in the path of the catastrophe. You can see immediately why this idea is so seductive to those investigating the Great Reset. In a single stroke, crustal displacement seems to offer an explanation for almost everything: the sudden freezing of the mammoths, the global flood myths, the abrupt climate reversal of the Younger Dryas, the idea of advanced civilizations wiped from the earth and forgotten. It is a grand unified theory of catastrophe, one event that could, in principle, account for all the scattered mysteries. It is the ultimate reset, the day the world literally rolled over and began again. But precisely because it explains so much so dramatically, we must be especially rigorous and especially honest about where it stands with mainstream science. And the answer is stark. The theory of rapid catastrophic crustal displacement of the kind Hapgood proposed and later writers have dramatized is not accepted by mainstream geology. It is, in the eyes of the scientific establishment, not a validated theory. The reasons are substantial. Since Hapgood's time, the science of how the Earth's outer layers move has been revolutionized by the theory of plate tectonics, which is one of the great triumphs of modern geology, supported by an enormous body of evidence. Plate tectonics describes how the Earth's outer shell is broken into plates that move, but slowly at rates of centimeters per year over millions of years, driven by the churning of the Earth's interior. This well-established framework does not support the idea that the entire crust can suddenly slip as a single unit over the interior in the rapid, catastrophic manner the pole shift theory requires. Mainstream geophysicists argue that the physical forces involved make such a sudden, wholesale displacement of the crust implausible that the proposed mechanisms, such as the weight of polar ice, are nowhere near sufficient to cause it, and that the geological record does not show the signatures such an event would leave. In short, the scientific consensus is that the continents have indeed moved, and the map of the world has indeed changed, but gradually, across immense spans of time, through the steady process of plate tectonics, not through sudden catastrophic lurches of the whole crust within human memory. The dramatic pole shift scenario remains outside the bounds of accepted science, a fascinating hypothesis that has not met the burden of proof. And yet, it would be incomplete to leave it there without acknowledging why the idea retains its grip. There is a distinction worth drawing. The specific, rapid, whole-crust displacement of Hapgood is rejected by mainstream science, but the broader, gentler phenomenon known as true polar wander, in which the Earth's axis of rotation shifts relative to the surface over very long geological timescales, is a real and studied phenomenon, though it operates far too slowly to produce the sudden catastrophe the reset hypothesis imagines. Proponents of catastrophe sometimes point to this real phenomenon as a foot in the door, arguing that if the poles can wander at all, perhaps they can, under extreme conditions, wander faster than we think. Mainstream science responds that the evidence simply does not support catastrophic speeds, and so the debate persists at the margins. Where does this leave us? With an idea of tremendous imaginative power and tremendous explanatory reach, but one that the weight of scientific evidence does not currently support. The day the Earth turned over makes for one of the most spectacular visions of catastrophe ever conceived. Whether it ever actually happened in the sudden and violent form the theory imagines remains, by the standards of mainstream science, deeply doubtful. It stands as the boldest and most speculative pillar of the Great Reset hypothesis, and also its most contested. But whether the cause was a shifting crust, a wandering pole, a cometary impact, or the turbulent death of the Ice Age, one category of evidence remains that no theory can ignore. Because whatever happened at the end of the last age, human beings all over the world seem to remember it. And the most widespread, most consistent, and most haunting of all these memories is the memory of a great flood that drowned the world. It is time to hear the testimony of the survivors. Set aside for a moment the science. Set aside the platinum and the nanodiamonds, the frozen mammoths, the shifting crust, and the wandering poles. Set aside the debates over mechanisms and the battles in the scientific journals, and listen instead to the human beings. Listen to what our ancestors across the entire face of the earth have been trying to tell us for thousands of years. Because when you gather up the oldest stories of the human race, the sacred traditions, the myths of origin and destruction, the tales passed down from generation to generation since before the dawn of writing, you find something that should stop you in your tracks. You find that peoples all over the world, in every inhabited corner of the planet, separated by vast oceans they could not cross, and by thousands of years of time, tell the same story. The story of a great flood, a world-destroying deluge that drowned the earth, annihilated humanity, and left only a handful of survivors to begin again. This is one of the most extraordinary facts in the entire study of human culture. And if catastrophe struck humanity at the end of the Ice Age, then these flood myths may be more than stories. They may be memory, eyewitness memory, handed down across the ages of the day the world ended. Let us survey the sheer scope of it. Begin in Mesopotamia, the land of the world's first cities and its oldest writing. Here, on clay tablets thousands of years old, we find the tale of a great flood sent to destroy mankind, and of a chosen survivor, warned in advance, who builds a great vessel to preserve life through the deluge. In the ancient epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor Utnapishtim tells how the waters rose and covered the world, how his ship came to rest upon a mountain, how he sent out birds to search for dry land. It is among the oldest written stories known to humanity, and it is a flood story. Move to the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, and we find the account the Western world knows best, the story of Noah, commanded to build an ark, to gather his family and the animals, and to survive the flood that drowns all the earth. The waters rise until they cover even the mountains, and only those aboard the ark endure. The parallels to the older Mesopotamian tale are unmistakable. The divine decision to destroy the world by water, the warned and chosen survivor, the great vessel, the birds sent out to find land. Travel east to India and you find the story of Manu, the first man, warned of a coming flood by a great fish who builds a boat to survive the deluge that sweeps across the world, and who preserves the seeds of life so that creation may begin again. Travel to Greece and you find Deucalion, who, warned that the gods intend to destroy humanity with a flood, builds a vessel to ride out the rising waters, and afterward repopulates a drowned world. But here is where it becomes truly staggering. This is not merely an old world phenomenon, a single story spreading among neighboring cultures, across the oceans to the Americas, entirely separate from Europe and Asia, and the flood is there too. Among the peoples of Mesoamerica, among the civilizations of the Andes, among the many nations of North America, we find, again and again, stories of a world destroyed by water, of a great flood that drowned the old world, of survivors who endured and repopulated the earth. Go to the islands of the Pacific, scattered across the greatest ocean on the planet, and the flood myths are there. Go to Australia, to the traditions of peoples who had been isolated for tens of thousands of years, and there too are stories of great floods that reshaped the world. Across Asia, across Africa, across Europe, across both American continents, across the islands of the sea, the same essential memory recurs in culture after culture after culture. Hundreds of distinct flood traditions have been recorded from peoples in every corner of the inhabited world, and this demands an explanation. Why? Why should this one story, above all others, be so nearly universal? Why should peoples who never met, who could not possibly have shared their tales, independently preserve the same memory of a world drowned by rising water? And notice too that the flood is often not the only element. In many of these traditions, the deluge comes accompanied by other terrors that echo with uncanny precision the very catastrophe we have been investigating. There are stories in which the flood is preceded or accompanied by fire from the sky, by burning, by things falling from the heavens. There are stories of a great darkness, a time when the sun was hidden, when the world was plunged into gloom. There are stories of terrible cold, of a world transformed, of the survivors huddling through a devastated landscape, fire from above, a long darkness, a great flood. Does this combination sound familiar? It is precisely the sequence that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis describes: a cosmic impact raining fire, an atmosphere choked with dust and smoke blotting out the sun, and catastrophic flooding as ice sheets melted and waters surged. The myths, in their own symbolic language, may be describing the very same apocalypse the geologists are arguing about. So how do we explain the near universality of the flood memory? There are broadly two ways to understand it. The first is the skeptical, cautious explanation, and it deserves genuine respect. Floods, this view points out, are among the most common of all natural disasters. Any people living near a river, a coast, or a lake will sooner or later experience a devastating flood, and such events naturally leave a deep mark on a culture's stories. Moreover, the end of the Ice Age genuinely did bring rising seas worldwide, a slow but universal rise that drowned coastlines everywhere over thousands of years, an experience that every coastal people on Earth would have shared. In this view, flood myths are common because floods are common, and because the whole world genuinely did experience rising waters at the end of the Ice Age. No single cataclysmic event is required to explain them. Different peoples facing different floods independently arrived at similar stories. And it is also true that in more recent centuries, the spread of certain religious traditions carried particular flood stories like that of Noah around the world, which can complicate the picture of what is truly independent. The second explanation is the one that resonates with the Great Reset hypothesis. It proposes that the flood myths are so widespread and so strikingly similar because they are all ultimately remembering the same thing or the same kind of thing. a real, catastrophic, and in some sense global event or cluster of events at the end of the Ice Age, when fire may have fallen from the sky, when the world was darkened, and when the waters rose and drowned vast portions of the inhabited world. In this view, the survivors of that catastrophe carried the memory forward, and it became the foundational story of culture after culture, the deepest and most persistent memory our species possesses, the memory of the time the world was destroyed and we had to begin again. Which explanation is correct? Perhaps in truth, there is something in both. It may be that some flood myths reflect local disasters, and others the slow global rise of the seas, and still others a genuine memory of sudden catastrophe, all woven together over the millennia into the great tapestry of flood traditions we find today. But it is very difficult, when you survey the sheer global scope of these stories, and the recurring accompanying details of fire and darkness, to shake the feeling that our ancestors are trying to tell us something, that behind the myths lies a real experience, seared so deeply into the collective memory of humanity that it survived across hundreds of generations in every land, wherever human beings endured to tell the tale. And this brings us to a crucial point about the Great Reset. So far, much of what we have examined lies deep in prehistory, at the contested boundary of science and speculation. It is easy, when dealing with events 12,000 years gone, to feel that we are in a realm too distant and too uncertain to grasp. So let us now do something different. Let us look at a reset we can actually see. A collapse that is not prehistoric, not mythological, but documented in the historical record. A moment when a rich, interconnected, sophisticated civilization fell apart rapidly and catastrophically, and much of its knowledge was lost. It is called the Bronze Age collapse, and it proves beyond any doubt that the reset is not merely a fantasy. It has happened within recorded history. Everything we have examined so far lies in the deep and contested past. The Younger Dryas, the comet, the frozen mammoths, the shifting crust, the flood myths, all of it reaches back into prehistory, into that fog before written records where certainty dissolves and the experts wage their endless wars. It would be understandable at this point to wonder whether the whole idea of a civilization-ending reset is simply too vast, too ancient, too speculative to take seriously. Whether societies really can collapse so completely, so quickly that knowledge is lost and the survivors are thrown back into darkness. So let us now set aside prehistory and speculation entirely and look at something we can actually see. Something written into the historical and archaeological record, beyond reasonable dispute. A moment when a rich, sophisticated, interconnected civilization spanning many kingdoms and cultures fell apart with terrifying speed. When cities burned, trade networks shattered, writing itself was lost, and populations collapsed. A genuine reset, not from the misty depths of the Ice Age, but from the well-documented history of the ancient world. It is known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it is one of the most important and sobering events in all of human history. To understand its significance, we first have to appreciate what was lost, because the world that collapsed was not primitive. It was, for its time, remarkably advanced, interconnected, and sophisticated. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East a little over 3,000 years ago in the Late Bronze Age. This was a world of great powers and flourishing civilizations, linked together in a vast web of trade, diplomacy, and culture. There was the mighty Egyptian Empire. There was the powerful Hittite Empire centered in Anatolia. There were the sophisticated Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece, the world of the great citadels whose legends would later echo in the tales of the Trojan War. There were the wealthy city-states of the Levantine coast and the powerful kingdoms of Mesopotamia and beyond. These civilizations were not isolated. They were bound together in an intricate international system, trading in metals, in luxury goods, in raw materials, exchanging diplomatic letters between kings, moving goods and people across the sea and along established routes. It was, in a very real sense, an early globalized world, a network of interdependent, literate, organized, palace-based societies at the height of their sophistication. And then, across a span of a few decades, roughly at the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 12th centuries before the Common Era, this entire glittering world came crashing down. The collapse was breathtaking in its scope and speed. Across the region, great cities were destroyed, many of them burned, their ruins bearing the marks of fire and violence. One after another, the centers of this civilization fell. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the age, disintegrated and vanished from history. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece collapsed, its palaces destroyed, its political order swept away. City after city along the eastern Mediterranean was sacked, abandoned, or reduced to a shadow of its former self. The great international trade networks that had bound the world together were severed. The interconnected system did not merely decline. It came apart rapidly and catastrophically in a cascade of destruction that toppled kingdom after kingdom. And here is the detail that should arrest our attention, the detail that makes this a true reset. Knowledge itself was lost. In the Mycenaean world of Greece, there had been a system of writing, a script used for administration and record keeping. When the Mycenaean civilization collapsed, that writing system vanished. It fell out of use entirely, and Greece descended into a period that historians have long called a dark age, a span of centuries during which the sophistication of the Bronze Age was lost. Populations declined, the great palaces were gone, and remarkably, the Greeks forgot how to write. Literacy itself disappeared from Greece for a period of centuries, until much later a new writing system was adopted and civilization climbed back toward the heights it had lost. Think carefully about what that means. Here is a documented historical case in which an advanced literate civilization collapsed so thoroughly that writing itself was lost, and a dark age of forgetting followed. This is not speculation. This is not myth. This is recorded history. The sophistication of the Bronze Age world was real, its collapse was real, and the loss of knowledge that followed was real. A whole world of interconnected kingdoms was, in effect, reset. What caused this catastrophe? Here, historians and archaeologists continue to debate, and the honest answer is that there was probably no single cause, but rather a combination of factors that struck together and reinforced one another, a perfect storm that overwhelmed a complex and interdependent system. Scholars point to a number of contributing pressures. There is evidence for climate change and prolonged drought in the region, which would have caused crop failures and famine. There were movements and invasions of peoples, including the mysterious groups known collectively as the Sea Peoples, who appear in Egyptian records as raiders and migrants descending upon the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. There were likely earthquakes. There was internal unrest and the breakdown of trade in critical materials. And crucially, the very interconnectedness of this world may have been its undoing. This last point is profound, and it speaks directly to our own time. The Bronze Age world was a system, a network of interdependent societies that relied upon one another for trade, for resources, for stability. And a highly connected, interdependent system has a hidden vulnerability. When one part fails, the failure can cascade, disrupt the trade in essential metals, and economies falter. Let famine strike one region and refugees and raiders destabilize the next. Topple one kingdom, and its trading partners are weakened, making them vulnerable in turn. Scholars sometimes describe this as a systems collapse, in which a web of stresses, none of which might have been fatal alone, combined and cascaded through an interconnected world until the whole structure came apart. The very sophistication and connectedness that made the Bronze Age world so impressive also made it fragile. And this is why the Bronze Age collapse matters so much to our investigation of the Great Reset. It provides us with a documented historical proof of concept. It demonstrates beyond any doubt several things that skeptics might otherwise dismiss as fantasy. It proves that advanced, sophisticated, interconnected civilizations really can collapse. It proves that they can collapse rapidly within a span of decades. It proves that knowledge, even something as fundamental as writing, really can be lost, and that dark ages of forgetting really do follow. And it proves that a combination of stresses, climate, disaster, migration, the breakdown of complex systems, can bring down a whole civilized world. Now, the Bronze Age collapse was not a global species-wide reset of the kind the deepest catastrophe theories propose. It was regional, centered on the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, and much of humanity elsewhere carried on. It did not extinguish civilization from the earth, but it is a window. It is a scale model, playing out in the clear light of recorded history, of the very process the Great Reset hypothesis describes on a grander scale. If a whole interconnected civilization could fall this far, this fast, and forget this much, from a combination of climate stress, disaster, and systemic fragility, then the deeper question presses upon us with new weight. What might a larger catastrophe do? What might a truly global cataclysm, a cometary impact, a climate convulsion like the Younger Dryas, have done to whatever human societies existed 12,000 years ago? If the sophisticated Bronze Age world could be reset by an ordinary perfect storm, how much more completely might an earlier world have been erased by an extraordinary one? The Bronze Age collapse gives us permission to take the Great Reset seriously. It shows us that the fall is real, that the forgetting is real, that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe. And it forces us to ask the question that has been building throughout this entire journey. If resets have happened at different scales across our history and prehistory, is there a pattern to them? Is there a rhythm? Is there, buried in the intervals between these catastrophes, something that looks like a clock? We have journeyed across a landscape of catastrophe. We have heard the ancient traditions of many destructions, the Egyptian priest and the Hindu Yugas. We have examined the violent end of the Ice Age, the Younger Dryas, and the contested evidence of a cosmic impact, the platinum, the nanodiamonds, the frozen mammoths. We have confronted the extreme idea of a shifting crust and heard the global memory of a great flood. And we have seen in the Bronze Age collapse that civilizations really can fall and forgetting really can follow. Now we arrive at the question that gives this entire subject its power and its dread, the question of the clock. Because a single catastrophe, however terrible, is just an accident of history, a bolt from the blue, but a cycle, a pattern, a rhythm of destruction that recurs at intervals, that is something else entirely. That is a mechanism, And if there is a mechanism, then there is a next time. So we must ask, as rigorously and as honestly as we can, is there a cycle? Is there a clock ticking beneath the history of catastrophe? Or are we, as human beings so often do, seeing patterns in what is really just randomness? Let us begin with the case for a cycle, for it is more substantial than skeptics sometimes allow. The first strand of the argument is astronomical, and it is genuinely grounded in real science. Our planet does not travel through an empty, peaceful void. The solar system is littered with debris, with asteroids and comets and streams of fragments left behind by the breakup of larger bodies. And the Earth, in its endless orbit, periodically passes through regions of this debris. When it does, we experience meteor showers, and, more rarely, the risk of a significant impact rises. Of particular interest to our investigation is a stream of debris associated with what is called the torrid meteor stream, which the Earth passes through at certain times of the year, producing meteor showers we can observe today. According to a compelling line of scientific thinking, this stream may be the scattered remains of a much larger comet that broke apart in the relatively recent past. In cosmic terms, the fragments of that shattered comet, some researchers propose, still travel together in a broad stream through which the Earth periodically passes. And within that stream there may be larger fragments, dense clusters of debris that the Earth encounters only at particular intervals. This idea, sometimes called coherent catastrophism, proposes that the risk of cosmic impacts is not spread evenly and randomly through time, but is concentrated, clustered, at the times when our planet passes through the denser parts of such a debris stream. In other words, the danger comes in cycles, governed by the clockwork of orbits. This is significant because it provides a genuine, physically plausible mechanism for periodic catastrophe. If the Younger Dryas was indeed caused by a cometary impact, and if that comet was part of such a stream, then the same stream might pose a recurring danger, delivering catastrophe whenever the Earth's orbit and the densest debris coincide. Here, potentially, is a real clock, the orbital rhythm of a stream of cometary fragments, periodically intersecting the path of the Earth. The second strand of the argument is the apparent spacing of catastrophes in the record itself. Proponents of the Great Reset point to what they see as a recurring interval, and the number that appears again and again in this discussion is around 12,800 years, the timing of the Younger Dryas onset, or intervals in that broad range. They look for evidence of earlier disruptions at roughly similar spacings and argue that catastrophes may cluster at intervals of roughly 12 to 13,000 years, or fractions and multiples thereof. If such a spacing were real, it would suggest a deep rhythm to the history of catastrophe, a beat that has recurred across the ages. And there is a third strand, more speculative still, which returns us to the ancient traditions. Recall the Hindu Yugas with their vast cycles of ages, and the Egyptian priests' insistence that destructions come again and again. Some proponents argue that these ancient cyclical cosmologies were not arbitrary inventions, but encoded in mythological and numerological form. A genuine awareness that catastrophe is periodic, a memory not just of a single disaster, but of the cyclical nature of disaster itself. In this view, the ancients were trying to tell us not only that the world had ended before, but that it would end again, on a schedule. Assemble these strands, and the case for a cycle looks intriguing. A physically real mechanism in the form of cometary debris streams that the Earth periodically crosses, an apparent spacing of catastrophes in the record, and ancient traditions that speak of destruction as recurring rather than singular. It is enough to make one wonder whether there truly is a clock ticking down toward a next appointment with catastrophe. But now, as we must always do in this investigation, we turn to the sober counter-arguments, and they are weighty. The most fundamental objection is a caution about the human mind itself. We are, by our very nature, pattern-seeking creatures. Our brains are exquisitely tuned to find patterns, rhythms, and cycles, even in data that is random. This tendency has served us well as a survival trait, but it also leads us badly astray, causing us to perceive meaningful cycles where there is only coincidence. When we look at a scatter of catastrophes across deep time and announce that we have found a recurring interval, we must ask ourselves with brutal honesty whether the pattern is really in the data or only in our eager minds. Skeptics point out that if you have enough catastrophes to choose from and enough flexibility in how you count the intervals, you can almost always find an apparent rhythm, whether or not any real cycle exists. This is a genuine and serious problem, and intellectual honesty demands that we take it seriously. Second, the mainstream scientific view does not accept that there is a well-established cycle of global civilization-ending catastrophes at intervals of around 12,800 years. The Younger Dryas is accepted as real, but as we have seen, its cause is debated, and the impact hypothesis that would tie it to a cometary stream is itself contested. Without a firmly established impact, the foundation for a 12,800-year impact cycle weakens considerably, and the deeper claimed catastrophes at earlier intervals are far more speculative and far less well documented than the Younger Dryas itself. Third, even the astronomical argument, though grounded in real science, must be handled with care. It is true that the Earth passes through debris streams, and true that impact risk is real and worth studying. But the specific claim that there is a well-defined, dangerous cycle of major impacts on a roughly 12,000-year schedule goes considerably beyond what mainstream astronomy has established. The reality of meteor streams does not by itself prove a regular clockwork of civilization-ending impacts. So where does the balance lie? Honestly, in a state of genuine uncertainty. There is a real and physically plausible mechanism for periodic cosmic danger in the form of debris streams like the Taurids. There is a real and dramatic catastrophe, the Younger Dryas, at a specific point in time. And there are ancient traditions that speak of recurring destruction. But there is also a powerful human tendency to overread patterns and a mainstream scientific caution that no firm cycle of global catastrophes has been established. The case for a clock is intriguing and unproven. It cannot be dismissed, but neither can it be asserted with confidence. And yet, even in this uncertainty, there is something that should give us pause, and it does not depend on proving any precise cycle at all. It is simply this: whether or not catastrophes come on a regular schedule, we know beyond any doubt that they come. We know that the Earth has been struck by objects from space repeatedly across its history. We know that the climate can convulse violently, as the Younger Dryas proves. We know that civilizations can collapse, as the Bronze Age proves. We know that the solar system contains debris capable of causing catastrophe, and that our planet moves among it. The Great Reset, in its essential claim, that global catastrophe has struck before and can strike again, does not actually require a precise clock. It requires only that such events are possible and recurring, which the evidence overwhelmingly supports. Which brings us at last to the question that has been waiting for us since the very beginning of this journey. If catastrophe has struck before, and if it can strike again, whether on a schedule or by chance, then the only question that truly matters is this one. Where do we stand now? Are we safe in our modern age of technology and knowledge? Or are we, in ways we scarcely allow ourselves to consider, overdue? We have reached the end of our journey through the history of catastrophe. We have traveled from the ancient memory of many destructions to the frozen mammoths of Siberia, from the platinum buried in the earth to the fallen cities of the Bronze Age, from the wheel of the Hindu Yugas to the cometary streams that thread through our solar system. And now at the last we must turn from the past and face the future. We must ask the question that gives this entire subject its edge of dread, the question that transforms it from an intellectual curiosity into something that touches every one of us. Are we overdue? Let us begin by being clear-eyed about where we actually stand. Whatever the truth about precise cycles, we know that the dangers which caused past catastrophes have not gone away. They are not relics of a more dangerous ancient world. They are present right now in our own time. Consider the cosmic threat. The solar system through which our planet travels is not a safe and empty place. It still contains asteroids and comets and streams of debris, some of them, as we have seen, possibly the remnants of larger bodies that broke apart in the recent cosmic past. The Earth still passes through these streams. Impacts still happen. In modern times, we have witnessed objects from space exploding in our atmosphere with the force of nuclear weapons, thankfully over remote or unpopulated areas, but powerful enough to remind us that the shooting gallery is real and that we are in it. Astronomers today actively scan the skies for near-Earth objects, tracking the asteroids and comets whose paths might one day cross our own, precisely because the threat of a significant impact is not fiction, but a recognized, if uncommon, danger. If a fragmenting comet or a large impactor helped end the Ice Age world, then the same category of threat still hangs over us. The sky has not been disarmed. Consider, too, the other faces of catastrophe. The climate, as the Younger Dryas so vividly demonstrated, is capable of sudden and violent shifts, of convulsions that can transform the world within a human lifetime. Our own sun, usually so steady, is capable of unleashing enormous bursts of energy, solar storms which, if they struck the Earth with sufficient force, could wreak havoc upon the technological systems on which we utterly depend. The Earth itself remains geologically alive, capable of great earthquakes, of volcanic eruptions on scales that dwarf anything in recent memory, of supervolcanic events that could darken skies across the globe. The forces that shaped the great catastrophes of the past have not been switched off. They are merely, for now, quiet. And here we arrive at the most sobering realization of all. It concerns not the likelihood of catastrophe, but our vulnerability to it. Because there is a powerful and dangerous illusion at the heart of modern life, the illusion that our technology has made us safe, that we, unlike the ancients, are masters of our world, insulated by our machines and our knowledge from the catastrophes that destroyed earlier peoples. This illusion may be precisely backwards. In crucial ways, our very sophistication may have made us more fragile, not less. Think back to the lesson of the Bronze Age collapse. It was the interconnectedness of that world, its dependence on complex networks of trade and exchange, that made it so vulnerable to cascading failure. When one part of the system failed, the failure spread. Now consider our own civilization. which is interconnected and interdependent to a degree that would have been unimaginable to any previous age. We depend on global networks for our food, our water, our power, our communications, our medicine, our entire way of life. Most people in the modern world do not grow their own food or secure their own water. We rely on vast, intricate, tightly coupled systems, electrical grids, supply chains, financial networks, digital infrastructure that span the entire planet and depend on one another in ways few of us fully understand. This makes us extraordinarily powerful. It also makes us extraordinarily fragile. A sufficiently large catastrophe, a major impact, a severe solar storm that crippled our electrical and electronic systems, an abrupt climate shock that devastated global agriculture would not merely cause localized damage. It could trigger a cascade of failures through our interconnected systems, and the very complexity that sustains our comfortable lives could turn against us with terrifying speed. The ancient hunter-gatherer, living directly off the land, was in some ways more resilient to a global catastrophe than a modern city dweller entirely dependent on systems they cannot see and could not replace. Strip away the grid, the supply chain, the network, and the sophistication that defines us becomes a liability. We have built a magnificent civilization upon a foundation of interdependence, and that foundation, for all its power, is more brittle than we like to admit. So, are we overdue? Let us answer honestly, resisting both false comfort and false panic. We should not claim, because the evidence does not support it, that a global catastrophe is imminent, or that some precise cosmic clock is about to strike. As we have seen, the case for an exact recurring cycle remains unproven, and we must be wary of our own hunger for patterns and for doom. No responsible reading of the evidence allows us to say that the end is scheduled for tomorrow. But neither can we honestly claim that we are safe, that catastrophe is a thing of the past, that the forces which reset the world before have somehow spared us for good. That comfort is not available to us. The threats are real. The mechanisms are real. The historical and geological record shows, again and again, that the world can change with brutal suddenness, that civilizations can fall, that knowledge can be lost, that the survivors of catastrophe forget and rebuild and imagine themselves to be the first. We are not exempt from the history of our own planet. We live, as every civilization before us has lived, in the pause between catastrophes, however long or short that pause may prove to be. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the Great Reset is not a prediction, but a perspective. It is the recognition that our civilization, which feels so permanent, so solid, so inevitable, is in truth a fragile and temporary thing perched upon a planet with a long history of violence in a solar system that has not finished with us. Every civilization that came before believed in its own permanence. The people of the drowned coastlines, the mammoth hunters of the warming world, the kings of the Bronze Age in their burning citadels, all of them, we may be sure, assumed that their world would go on, that tomorrow would resemble today. And for each of them, there came a time when it did not. The ancients tried to warn us. In their myths of many destructions, in their wheels of rising and falling ages, in their universal memory of the flood and the fire and the long darkness, they were passing down across the abyss of time a message written in the only language that could survive the forgetting, the language of story. Do not imagine, they were telling us, that you are the first. Do not imagine that you are safe. The world has ended before, and it will end again. Remember, Whether the Great Reset comes from the sky or from the earth, from the sun or from the fragile systems of our own making, and whether it comes in 1,000 years or 10,000 or tomorrow, the wisest response is neither terror nor denial, but humility. The humility to recognize that we are not the masters of our world, but its guests. That our civilization is a candle flame, bright and beautiful and precious, flickering in a vast and ancient darkness. And that the same forces which wiped the slate clean before are still out there, patient, indifferent, and waiting.